It's truly unfortunate what happened to Tony Hawk. What was once seen as not only just a great series of sports titles, but just great video games in general, unfortunately fell from grace with a litany of mediocre entries. There was about a 13-year period in which it seemed that every single time a new game in the series was announced, it was immediately lambasted with poor reviews. This is due to a number of factors. Debatably, the first major blunder for the series was Tony Hawk Ride, a game with a focus on motion controls with an expensive and unresponsive peripheral. This was no doubt a response to the absolutely gigantic success of the Wii at the time, driving a much bigger and more casual audience to buy more video games. Now, Tony Hawk Ride was released at a time where just about anything with a unique gimmick was going to sell okay, thanks to products by Nintendo like the Wii Fit Balance Board, and even Activision's own Guitar Hero series. So it managed to push a decent amount of copies and peripherals, despite overwhelming negative reception. Now, this is the point where Activision should have just taken their money and ran, but they got greedy. Already in development before Ride even released, Tony Hawk Shred would come out the very next year, once again to negative reception. Now, it doesn't really matter if the critics don't like the game if people are still picking up copies for their families. Unfortunately for Activision, the quality of Ride and the changing landscape of the games industry led to Tony Hawk Shred selling a mere 3,000 copies in its first week. The people could see right through it and weren't willing to throw their money away on an unfinished mess of a game. Subsequently, the Tony Hawk series was put on hiatus, and when it eventually came back, it was only a shell of what it once was. Now, I'm telling you this story to put into perspective how sad it was for me as a kid to see one of my absolute favorite franchises fall from grace like this. There will be people that argue that Project 8, American Wasteland, or Proving Ground were the beginning of the end. And also, I've heard the opinion that Underground 2 was the downfall of the series by people who hate fun. But all of the aforementioned titles at least still felt like Tony Hawk games to me. It was when Robomoto stepped in and started developing the titles in the series when it became clear that there just wasn't any soul left here. Fortunately for fans of the series, in 2020 we finally got a game that would reclaim some of that magic of the original series, but I'll be touching more on that later. For now, I want to run through the games in chronological order and just give my quick thoughts on each of them, discussing personal favorites along the way, as well as ones that definitely didn't meet the mark. I'm not going to be looking at the Ride or Shred games in this video, as I'm not going to shell out cash for an expensive peripheral for a game that I already know is not worth anyone's time. And I also kind of see them more as spin-offs. I also won't be looking at most handheld games. Those will probably get their own video at some point. I want this to be a more positive look at the Tony Hawk series, so I'm basically just going to be looking at the mainline games here. That means all the games on PS1 and PS2, and a few modern entries thrown in also. So without further ado, let's talk about Tony Hawk's Pro Skater, the very first title in the series. I think it's fair to say that the game is well renowned for a reason, but it's always been interesting to me how no one could have predicted its impact. Because at the end of the day, this is a pretty standard extreme sports title. Now, perhaps it's not fair to call it standard when it actually set the standard, and don't get me wrong, there's a lot to like here. But I will admit that as a massive fan of the series, this game is kind of hard to come back to. You can forget about any sort of more advanced mechanics like spine transfers, pivots, hell even reverts and manuals aren't in this game. This is a true back to the basics experience, but it's still overall enjoyable. The first 3 titles in the series use a goal system, creating these mini sandboxes and levels where you try to get as many done as you can in one single run. This is a really fun approach and works for any Tony Hawk game, even the later ones with classic modes included. One thing this game absolutely gets right is the iconic levels. Almost every single level in the game is incredibly memorable, to the point where many of them were remade several times in different entries of the series. Levels like Mall, Downtown, and Warehouse would appear in the classic modes of future games, and while they're plenty of fun here, I have to admit I prefer playing the levels on Underground 2 and American Wasteland. This game is definitely a masterpiece in its own right, but in my own personal opinion, it kind of feels like when a band has a decent first record, but then it takes them a couple to find the sound that really works for them. Thankfully, it only goes up from here. Tony Hawk's Pro Skater 2 is probably the most acclaimed game in the series, and there's a good reason for that. The first game was an unexpected smash hit, and I think the timing surrounding it was perfect. The hype was high after the original did so well, and there seemed to be an increase in the interest of skating culture in general, at least partially spawned from the success of the first game. I know personally that the Tony Hawk series was what introduced me to skateboarding, and even though I was never really good at it, I never would have thought to pick it up without these games. Here's the deal, and I'm gonna preface this by saying that Pro Skater 2 is a fantastic game and you should definitely play it, but a lot of my qualms with the first title are still here. I personally don't believe that there's any way that this game belongs at the number 3 spot of all time on Metacritic, and that's coming from someone who was obsessed with this series. That being said, as a sequel to the original, It's great, and certainly improves on what the game already did well. They added the manual, which is such a massive change. It completely alters the way you approach combos. The levels are just as good, if not better, than the original. The goals are fun and varied. They added the level editor here. There's a lot of massive improvements, and the game is definitely worth your time. I just personally think that this game isn't even in my top 4 of the series, let alone one of the greatest games of all time. Something this game does have is loads of content. This is the first game in the series to introduce the Create a Skater feature, and it will be added to every subsequent entry. This one is a little bare bones compared to some of the later ones, but it's hard to fault it for that, given that it was their first attempt at it. There's also plenty of unlockables, including Spider-Man, which is fitting considering Neversoft also developed the PS1 Spider-Man game. Right now you're looking at footage of the PS1 version, since that's by far the one most of you have played, but this game was available on a number of platforms, and even has a sort of remake on the Xbox. Released 1 year later as an early original Xbox title, Tony Hawk's Pro Skater 2X was a port of the first 2 Pro Skater games in one package, also featuring 5 new levels. This game is absolutely massive, and I'd say up until a couple years ago, the best way to play either of the original 2 titles. In my personal opinion, it still doesn't compare to the next few entries in the series for me. But if you want to go back to the old feel of those original 2 Tony Hawk games, this is it. The graphics look nice and crisp, and the jump to 60 FPS is a nice touch. Unfortunately, it's not easily accessible if you don't own an original Xbox. However, it's playable on the Xbox 360 if you can find an old copy, and I was able to get it running through emulation on PC for this video, so either of those are good options if you've missed this one. 2X wasn't quite as well received as the original Pro Skater 2, and that's because it actually came out after Pro Skater 3. And I think that's fair, because in my own honest opinion, Pro Skater 3 is the first absolute banger in the series. Pro Skater 3 was the first to release on PlayStation 2, so I feel for that reason it was a lot of people's first experience playing Tony Hawk on a 6th gen console. And the jump forward, not only graphically, but also just in the smoothness of the gameplay, is instantly noticeable. The trend of the games getting exponentially better with each release is continued here, with in my opinion probably the best level set in the series. The physics have been slightly tweaked, and the game just feels smooth as butter. This is truly the first game in the series where I feel like I can actually combo properly, where in the previous 2 entries I feel almost handicapped by the lack of mechanics. Again, it's hard to fault them for taking a couple games to find their footing, but I'm so glad they did. Everything is improved here. Each level is meticulously crafted and fun with great goals included. The graphics obviously get a bump, even from the 6th gen ports of Pro Skater 2, and even minute details like the level editor and the amount of cheats at your disposal is much better than the previous 2 games. I remember really breaking this game with cheats as a kid, and being so blown away by the amount of unlockable characters. Even the guy behind the counter has different animations depending on which character you selected. That's so cool. Speaking of unlockable characters, there's some great ones in here, like Wolverine and Darth Maul. I always loved the Neversoft guy, which is just the eye from their logo on a body. Can I also just say that this is probably the coolest main menu in the entire series, and probably one of the coolest main menus ever? Future titles also include some cool menus, but just having it be inside the skate shop and customizing your boards and created skaters in here was such a cool decision. This game retains the same approach of goal-based levels and 2-minute runs, which I think is best executed here. They've really come a long way since just having the 5 basic goals per level in the original, and I think they're stretching it to its absolute limit here. This is probably why they decided to move away from this structure in the next few titles, but I'm getting ahead of myself. There are Tony Hawk games that I enjoy playing gameplay-wise a lot more than this one, but I don't know if there's a game in the series that matches this game's level of charm and polish. There's so many minute details in this game that make me wonder how it was able to be developed in only a year. Did you know that you sometimes get different dialogue from the workers in the foundry depending on which character you choose? This attention to detail is what really makes this game special and still worth playing over 20 years later. So, where do you go from here? If Pro Skater 3 was the simplicity of the early Tony Hawk games perfected, then Pro Skater 4 was the genesis of something new entirely. This is the game that completely switched the main focus away from the 2-minute runs and small sandboxes, instead giving us fleshed out huge levels with goals dispersed around and no timer to worry about. It's up to you which approach you prefer, but I have to say I think this was a good choice for the series moving forward. Now, I don't think the gameplay is quite perfected yet, but we're close. This game adds the spine transfer, which is a very welcome inclusion. It's one of those features that's hard to do without when revisiting earlier titles. They also added skitching in this game, which is kinda pointless, but ultimately still really fun. When it comes to levels, I'm gonna be honest, a lot of you will probably disagree, and I think this game has some great levels, but it's probably my personal least favorite so far in this regard. A lot of the levels just have this really drab look to them, and aren't nearly as memorable as some of the previous game's output. However, that's not to say that there aren't some great levels here. The opening one, College, is a really great Pro Skater level. And though it's probably not the best design-wise, I always love the charm of the zoo level, and I have really fond memories of it. The goals being given out to you by other skaters is a really good thing, I think. But a lot of the goals are mostly the same kind of thing you would be doing in the previous titles, like collecting skate or getting a high score. All Tony Hawk games do this, so I'm not trying to single this one out. I think it works for the most part. However, one thing I think this game suffers from is the lack of story. Later games would give you a plot to give you a reason to keep moving forward, and I think that helps for the more open approach. It wasn't really needed in the previous titles because ultimately they felt a lot more condensed and arcadey, but this game has a lot of goals and some really big levels, so something to keep you going would be appreciated. I know it seems a bit weird to complain about too much content, and none of it is really a slog to get through, besides some more challenging goals later on, but I think the real issue is just how the game moves you forward. There really isn't any incentive to beat the game besides just unlocking everything, and so even though this game is a blast, just like any of the Neversoft Tony Hawk titles, this one just kind of feels like a middle child to me. It's stuck somewhere between the older design philosophy and the big bombastic, story-focused trilogy that would follow. With all that being said, this game would still get my recommendation for fans of the series, but if you asked which Tony Hawk game should I play first, it would probably have to be this game's sequel. Tony Hawk's Underground is the first game in the series to have a story mode, and a really good one at that. I'm not going to give a rundown of the whole thing because I feel it's kind of redundant, but I will say that the characters are written well, the twists and turns are effective, and the ending is bittersweet and fitting. It's about a skater who rises to success with multiple sponsorships and the betrayal of his hometown best friend, and it works really well for this game. It's a down-to-earth story that has genuine emotional beats and satisfying moments of comeuppance, and it's probably still the best story in the entire series. My problem with Pro Skater 4 not really giving you a reason to move forward is solved here because of this, and I feel like it's the best reason to come back to Underground. You can once again fast travel to goals, and I always thought it was weird how Pro Skater 4 and Underground were the only two games in the series to have this feature. The biggest change to the gameplay here is that you can now get off your board. Now this has a functional purpose to get yourself set up for a line before you start a combo, but it also has a distinct purpose within combos themselves, and it's a huge inclusion. If you get off your board during a combo, you get a small timer before the combo ends, allowing you to basically buffer multiple combos together and readjust yourself as needed before ending one. It's a really great feature, and it's another thing that makes the earlier titles harder to come back to. The engine has been tweaked a decent bit too. It may look similar, but this game definitely feels more fluid and smooth than Pro Skater 4. I love Underground. I might have talked about a couple classics in this list already that I love dearly, but for me, this is the point in the series where we start to reach masterpiece status. I think a lot of people are going to be upset with me saying I didn't love all the levels in Pro Skater 4, but I think that this game does the kind of more realistic and grimy aesthetic a lot better in its levels. Speaking of levels, this game continues the trend of these games having really fun unlockable levels. And though the one in this game, Hotter Than Hell, is not the most fun map to skate in, the Kiss cameo is really great. Honestly, it's kind of hard for me to talk about this game without just gushing on and on about it. Even though this isn't my absolute favorite game in the series personally, I think it's probably the best Tony Hawk game. The gameplay and engine is better than ever. The presentation is great with a sort of grungy aesthetic. The new additions in your moveset make for the biggest combos in the series so far, and the levels range from good to great. Underground should definitely be your starting point with the series if you miss the Tony Hawk games. There's so much fun to be had here, and I recommend you at least emulate it if you can't track down a copy. So, at this point in the series, it had to have been pretty hard for Neversoft to figure out where exactly to go next. You had straightforward skateboarding games earlier on in the series, but Underground changed the way that these games were going to be approached. In the end, they ultimately decided to keep the story-focused gameplay of the previous game, but they amped up the action and silliness tenfold. I've seen a lot of people refer to Underground 2 as more of a Jackass and Bam Margera themed game than a Tony Hawk game. And to some extent, that's true. Every cutscene is filled with adolescent boy humor and goofy or insanely over-the-top moments. For this reason, a lot of people prefer the more stripped-back early titles or the more down-to-earth story of the original Underground. But I've gotta say, Underground 2 is just fun. I really appreciate the fact that this game doesn't take itself very seriously, and instead focuses on bringing you gameplay improvements and big crazy set pieces. Gone is the more drab look of levels in the previous two titles, and most levels in this game are really vibrant and colorful. They're also mostly really fun to skate in. This game actually has a goal system that I find a bit more reminiscent of the early titles than I do Underground or Pro Skater 4. Instead of every goal being given to you by an NPC, there's a lot of them that don't disrupt the flow of gameplay whatsoever. This makes the game really short if you know what you're doing, but you still have the option of completing every goal instead of just the ones required to progress to the next level. So even though it's kind of easy to forget, this game is a direct sequel to Underground, with your main character being canonically the same as in Underground, and even Eric Sparrow making a return as this game's punching bag, which is always nice to see. The story is really simple and a lot less down to earth than Underground's more serious and engaging story, but I don't think that's necessarily a bad thing. The plot here is basically that there are two teams led by Tony Hawk and Bam Margera, and they go to a bunch of different cities and destroy things for points. And whoever has the most points wins in the end, with the loser paying for the cost of the whole trip. It's entirely just an excuse to have these crazy destruction cutscenes and bring you from location to location, but it serves the game nicely. I don't have a problem with the simplified story if the game presents it confidently and it remains fun for the duration. And I think that this is one of the most fun games in the series. Once again, there's a decent bit of new mechanics added here, like flips and rolls and the Nada spin. And this is one of the most complete Tony Hawk engines you can play, which is probably why they used it as a basis for Thug Pro, but I'm getting ahead of myself. Another thing worth mentioning is the excellent Classic mode. This almost makes Underground 2 essentially two games in one. If you enjoy the gameplay and physics of Underground 2 but aren't a big fan of the story, you can just play Classic mode, which basically has the same setup as the first three games in the series, and even brings back old levels from those games, which are really fun to play in this engine. This game just has a lot of content. Even without Classic mode, it's a great overall package. But any problems I could even have with this mode are kind of outweighed by just being super impressed that it's included for free anyway. When if this game came out 10 years later, it could have been a $20 DLC or something, or even a full game. Overall, I think Underground 2 is amazing, and I don't agree with the sentiment shared with some of the community that it's a glorified jackass game and is worth skipping. Is it really silly and stupid? Sure, but it's mechanically in-depth and really fun, as well as just being packed to the brim with content. I know I said I wasn't going to talk about many handheld games in this video, but I wanted to give a quick shout to Tony Hawk's Underground 2 Remix. Remix is a port of the game to PSP, and it's really fully featured, even including some new levels and restructuring the story mode to make it slightly longer. I still wouldn't say it's the definitive way to play the game, because unfortunately, it being made for the PSP, it has some small concessions that hurt gameplay. One of these concessions is that the game runs at 30 FPS instead of 60, and that does really get to me in these Tony Hawk games that usually run so smoothly. However, it's a really great way to play the game on the go, and it's really impressive that they were able to cram this game onto a handheld from 2004, and add a bunch of extra content on top of that. So this port also gets my recommendation if you've got a PSP lying around, or just want to emulate it and see what the new levels are like. Before we talk about the next game in the series, I want to bring up that I've heard the sentiment that this next entry is where the series really starts to lose its steam. However, I have to admit that even though I've tried to be as unbiased as possible in these reviews, it's absolutely impossible for me to look at this game completely objectively, as it's my favorite game in the series and the one I've undoubtedly spent the most time with. However, hopefully I can convince some of you that don't quite enjoy this one as much to boot it back up and give it another chance. Tony Hawk's American Wasteland was released in 2005 for all the 6th-gen consoles, as well as being the first in the series to appear on a 7th-generation console, the Xbox 360. Though not a direct sequel to the Underground games, it definitely feels more like those titles than any other games in the series. Once again being story-centered and having a focus on destroying things around the maps like in Underground 2. This game is, however, significantly longer than Underground 2, and it's more similar to the first Underground in length. American Wasteland starts with one of 5 pre-made characters to choose from. You're an outcast who wants to get away from your suburban life and become a skating legend in LA. It's a simple motivation and definitely a little corny, but it works for a game that doesn't take itself too seriously like this. Your main goal throughout the game is to grab new pieces for what's called the skate ranch and basically turn it into the ultimate skate park. Without going too in depth, I think the story of this game, while not amazing, is definitely satisfying enough, and gives you plenty of motivation to keep going. The characters are varied and funny, they do a good job of pushing the story forward, but also keeping you entertained with their personalities and humor. What I believe really sets American Wasteland apart from the others is the gameplay. And when it comes to control and mechanics, this game has the most in-depth version of the Tony Hawk engine even to this day. Boned ollies, pivots that act as flat ground reverts, bank drops, wall runs and flips, vert wall plants, and a lot more. This game adds so much to the engine that it's honestly intimidating at first. But learning to use all these abilities and exploit the engine is what makes the game so mechanically satisfying to this day. Exploits like BHRAs, butt slaps, and neuroplants, though possible in earlier games, are a lot easier to achieve here, and they add a whole new layer of fun to the game mechanics, and despite the fact that they're essentially just glitches, they become their own advanced techniques that inevitably start to feel like integral parts to the game's design. There's even a fully fleshed out BMX mode that honestly feels pretty good, even though I only ever used it to complete required missions. They really just threw anything and everything at the wall and tried to make this the most content-dense Tony Hawk game ever, and it shows. Yes, the engine is a little glitchy and stuff doesn't always work the way it should, but when it does, it's more satisfying than any other Tony Hawk game in my opinion. The quick pick-up-and-play nature of the series has always been appealing, but this game takes the Pro Skater series to a new level mechanically. While that may deter some, others will find a fun and fluid system if you're willing to give it a chance. The air quotes open world that's provided here is actually pretty fresh and interesting. And yes, I know that the hallways that you skate through are just a clever way to mask loading zones, but it goes a long way to keeping you in the experience. This was in the age of game design where you had 4 GB PS2 games committed to keeping you immersed through the use of clever loading screens. Or even none at all. And it was really charming and something I miss. Another neat little touch is the day and night cycle in the game. It's not a big thing, but it's details like this that may go unnoticed at first that add a lot to the game's charm. East LA is probably my favorite level in the series, but there's a lot of great levels here. Once you collect every piece for the skate ranch, you can skate through the completed one in free skate mode, and it's pretty cool. It's a nice feeling to go through the ranch and see all the pieces that you got during the story, and there's a good sense of accomplishment. I've always thought the skate ranch had a really cool aesthetic. The game in general is very aesthetically pleasing. The hand-drawn flashback scenes have a great charm to them in particular, and I love how you can make your character look like they came straight out of a 2005 Hot Topic. The part where the game's presentation severely falters is in the cutscenes. The cutscenes are almost Sonic Adventure levels of laughably terrible. Incoming! It definitely doesn't ruin the game, but as far as I know, no other Tony Hawk game has cutscenes quite this awkward. That being said, some of them are pretty funny, and I honestly look forward to them when replaying the game. Another somewhat major gripe I have with the game is that there are paywalls for missions, and you have to go back and do tagging challenges or talk to this random homeless guy who gives you money to do tricks for him. This isn't too bad on paper. I know they're just trying to drill all the new mechanics into your head, but especially on higher difficulties, the paywall is way too high, and you have to do way too many of these challenges. I mean, in this part of the game, there's a $400 paywall. You only get $25 for most of the missions this guy gives you, which means you're going to be spending at least an hour or so doing nothing but these tedious missions in a typical run-through on Sick. I would stick to the lower difficulties for this game. Sick is just a little too grind-heavy for me. Returning from Thug 2 is Classic Mode, which is once again a welcome feature, once again featuring levels from the first 3 games and even some of the levels from the aforementioned PSP port of Underground 2. It's not perfect by any means. Some of the levels not from the original 3 games really don't feel like they were designed with this game mode in mind, but for a free inclusion in the game, it's a really fun time sink. Overall, though this game is indisputably more unpolished than most Tony Hawk games before it, and maybe even a little too ambitious for its engine, it still manages to feel fresh and fun based on controlling gameplay alone. I often find it difficult to go back to earlier Tony Hawk titles not having some of the mechanics this game introduces, because the absolute absurdity of some of the things you can pull off here is its strongest aspect. This engine is almost broken, and yet it's by far my favorite one to come back to. To reiterate, Underground is probably the best game in the series, but this is undeniably my personal favorite, and if you skip this one, I highly recommend you give it a shot. So for each of these titles so far, I have a lot of very early and defining memories with them, and a ton of hours spent in each of them. However, we're reaching the point in the series where that's not the case anymore. Project 8 was the last game in the series that I played when it was new, and I only had the PS2 port, which is a much different experience. Project 8 was one of those late 6th gen and early 7th gen games that was released on almost every console available at the time, and the 6th and 7th gen versions were handled by different studios. I'm going to be looking at the PS2 and PS3 ports in this video and briefly comparing them, because going back to Project 8, I was a bit shocked to find that I didn't end up preferring the more modern, state-of-the-art 7th gen port of the game. Don't get me wrong, Project 8 is pretty decent regardless of which version you play, but I would say to avoid the PS3 port if you can. It's capped at 30 and runs really poorly, even on original hardware. If you want to play the 7th generation port of Project 8, definitely stick to the 360. I know it can be annoying to complain about performance, but these games have all been running at 60 FPS since Pro Skater 3, and it's really noticeable and annoying to go back. That's actually one of my least favorite things about the 7th gen. It's really when developers stop caring about the game running well as long as it looks good. And honestly, Project 8 doesn't look bad, but it certainly wasn't worth the graphical boost to have it run worse, especially given that the 360 and even OG Xbox ports run at 60. Project 8 is the first game that feels like a complete overhaul in a really long time. Each entry up to this point has been more about adding mechanics incrementally between releases, taking what the previous game has done and doing it better or adding more features. And you could make the argument that that's what happens here, except this game doesn't have all the mechanics of American Wasteland, and the physics have received a few tweaks, making this game just feel a lot different from previous entries. It doesn't feel bad once you get used to it, but this doesn't feel like it's running on the same engine as Underground or Pro Skater 4, because it's not. You could argue that this is a good thing and makes the game stand out compared to previous entries, and I would agree for the most part. However, it doesn't really scratch the same itch for me. One of this game's new features is called Nail the Trick. You go into slow motion and control your feet with the analog sticks, sort of giving us a freestyle, make-your-own-trick mode. I really like this idea a lot on paper, but I can't be the only one who just never really used it. Like, it just isn't as responsive as it should be, and I found it to be more of a pain than anything to deal with when I'm trying to complete challenges that require it. One thing I really enjoy about Project 8 is mission structure. Project 8 includes your typical NPC gives you something to do type goals that was introduced in Pro Skater 4, but also has goals more like Underground 2 or the classic games that you can do on the fly while skating in the open world. This is really cool because it gives players an option on how to progress forward in the game. I will say also that the open world here is a lot more convincing and natural than American Wasteland's loading hallways, even though I still think those are cool. So the 6th gen ports of Project 8 do away with the open world entirely, opting to segment the world and put them into individual levels. And though the open world is missed, it's not too bad of a compromise. Unlike the 7th gen ports, which run on an entirely new engine, the PS2 and Xbox versions run on the same engine as American Wasteland, and even includes some of the same tricks that aren't in the newer one, like bone dollies. This version of the game feels a lot more like a traditional Tony Hawk experience, and is my preferred version to play nowadays. I think the 7th generation version is better in just about every way, given you're playing it on the 360, but I definitely prefer the overall feel of the last gen version. Project 8 also received a port to the PSP, and like Underground 2 Remix, the PSP port has a lot of exclusive content, including a classic mode just like American Wasteland and Underground 2. In the main game, there are classic mode goals kind of thrown about in the open world that will sort of scratch that itch for you, but only the PSP port gets an actual classic mode with old levels from previous games returning. For that reason alone, it's worth checking out. Overall, I enjoy Project 8. I think it's a pretty solid game, but I'm not the biggest fan of all its new inclusions. And I'm even less of a fan of the way this game backpedals on the mechanics introduced in American Wasteland. They already had such an in-depth and engaging gameplay engine, and I think it's a bit of a shame that they worked so hard to completely overhaul it from the ground up, and ended up creating something that I just don't feel was an improvement in any way. There's a lot of great ideas here, but I think that it would have been better for them to reassess the series at this point, and do something based on what they knew worked for these games. Unfortunately, the next mainline game in the series would be the last one developed by Neversoft. But before we look at Proving Ground, I want to take a brief look at Tony Hawk's Downhill Jam on the PS2. This game is almost more of a spin-off that's centered around racing, and it's actually an idea that was planned to be the focal point of the first game entirely, with every level intended to be downhill. In a way, this is that original idea for the entire series fully realized. This is my first time ever playing Downhill Jam, and I'm glad to say I'm pleasantly surprised by it. I think this is a decent entry in the series, and even though I consider it a spin-off, if you're looking for something different, I think it's worth a look. The gameplay is really fluid and smooth, and you can tell it runs on the American Wasteland engine. But there's an aforementioned focus on racing, so some of the skating mechanics are dumbed down a bit. Something that really messes with my head playing this game is the lack of the manual. I understand why they took it out. They want you to focus on the racing and other challenges like combat, but I do feel like it was a mistake not to include it here. Another thing missing is any sort of free skate mode, which, again, I understand. However, it would be nice to have a mode that let me go through the levels at my own leisure. You never really spend more than 45 seconds to 1 minute on any of these levels besides some of the very last ones. Honestly, if this game had a classic mode or something goal-based to sink your teeth into, or even a free skate mode that loops you back through the levels airport style, it would be a much better game. Also, forgive me if I'm wrong, but where is the Downhill Jam level? You know, the level from the first game that this game definitely legitimately takes its title from? I feel like it's kind of an insane move to make a game named after a classic iconic level that's appeared multiple times in the series and then not even include it. I get that they'd probably have to change around the design a little bit, but still. It's like you bought Guitar Hero Metallica or something and all it has is Weird Al tracks. Overall though, even though this game has some pretty big omissions and a notable lack of content, I think it's worth booting up for 15 minutes of fun every now and again. Unfortunately, we are way past the golden age for Tony Hawk games at this point, but there's one more Neversoft title to discuss, and it's one I had very little experience with going into this video, so my hopes going in were pretty high. Is Proving Ground the last swan song of the series? Not really, but it is plenty of fun. It feels really similar to the 7th gen version of Project 8, but it just feels a bit smoother here. I could be wrong entirely, but I felt like it was easier to get high speed. And I enjoy some of the new mechanics like the aggro kick. Nail the Trick returns from Project 8 and I used it as little as ever. Maybe I'm the only one who doesn't really enjoy this mechanic. I don't really hate it, but it just kind of breaks up the flow of gameplay for me. Another thing returning from Project 8 is the real open world, and it's once again pulled off convincingly here. I respect the move to make the game look as grimy and realistic as possible while having you skate through these big cities. But damn, it is honestly hard to look at after a while. We're an entire console generation ahead and 6 years later, and I will 100% take the vibrant and colorful levels of Pro Skater 3 over this. This game makes the grimiest Pro Skater 4 levels look like cartoons with its overcast and washed out image, and it's not something I totally hate, but definitely not something I'm a big fan of. Another thing returning is the spot challenges from Project 8, and I'm once again for this. Anything to put more things to do in the open world and keep it engaging. Something they've added here is this little rigging menu where you can add props into the world in real time. And this is probably the coolest unique feature of the entire game. It's a really neat idea and helps ease the pain of this game's lack of content besides the main story. It's starting to get kind of annoying the way that for every step they've been making forward with new mechanics and cool ideas, they take away so much from already established series mainstays. The park editor, though really cool, isn't as fleshed out as earlier entries. The Create a Skater is a lot more bare bones this time around. There's no free skate outside of 2-player mode on the 360 version. It's starting to annoy me a little bit. It was easier to forgive Downhill Jam for lacking so much content when it's really a budget spin-off kind of game. But this is the last Neversoft Tony Hawk title, and I'd really like there to be more options here. There is a classic mode here, but it's severely gimped compared to previous titles. You can only skate through the levels from this game, and even though the open world is cool, I don't think that the level design in general is anything to write home about. Compare this to American Wasteland or Underground 2, or even Project 8 on PSP, where Classic Mode is instantly accessible from the menu and features a multitude of different maps from older entries on top of the main single-player campaign chock full of new and fun maps. All of this being said, I can at least feel the effort in this one, and the gameplay itself is really good. It's just a shame that I don't really see myself coming back to it all that often. For posterity's sake, I decided to boot up the PS2 version to see if I might enjoy that better, and it's not too bad considering all they had to cram into an aging console. It feels like a B Studio game, and that's because it is. But it also feels like the older Tony Hawk games. So if you prefer that style, this might be the version for you. I'd say personally, stick to the 7th gen version and see if you like it. I think there's some really great ideas here, but they weren't all executed too well. But this is a fun game with some flaws. So after Proving Ground failed to sell as well as previous entries, this is where Neversoft parted ways with the series. Unfortunately, due to that, there's only one more game I have left to talk about that's going to be an actual positive review. The rest of them range from bad to worse. To simplify the story extremely, after Activision took Neversoft off of Tony Hawk duties to work on the Guitar Hero games, the keys to the series were in the hands of another company, Robomoto. Robomoto was made up of former EA and Midway employees with the focus of bringing the Tony Hawk games to a more casual audience, with their first game ever being Tony Hawk Ride. As I mentioned in the beginning of this video, I'm not going to talk about Ride and Shred. I might get around to them one day, but honestly, do you really need me to sit here and tell you how bad these games are? I feel like the gameplay says all you need to know. Anyway, a few years after Ride and Shred did so poorly they literally caused the series to be put on hold, we got Tony Hawk's Pro Skater HD. The goal with this game was to give us a remastered way to play through Pro Skater 1 and 2 levels, with the classic gameplay of the first 3 titles. It seems like a foolproof plan. In fact, it's a very familiar plan if you've been paying attention to this video, but the execution here is just weak. First of all, there's only 7 levels here, as opposed to Tony Hawk 2X, which had every level from the first 2, as well as 5 new ones. There were 3 levels from Pro Skater 3 that were sold as downloadable content. but that's been scrubbed from all stores and is now basically lost unless you pirate it. Now, I can almost forgive the lack of content here given that the game was priced at $15, even on launch. But this is in no way a big return to the Tony Hawk series. This is a watered down, mechanically inept, slow and crappy engine that doesn't feel very fun to play. It's not the worst thing in the world, and you can still get in here and do some decent combos, but it's pretty clear that Robomoto has no clue on what made these games fun to begin with. I get that it's supposed to be a nostalgic look back, but did you really have to remove almost all of the mechanics from later entries? There's no spine transfers, wall plants, anything like that. There wasn't even a revert on launch. And I'm sorry, but nostalgia isn't a good enough excuse to warrant removing features that have been in your series for years. I remember when I first bought this game and it didn't even have the option to change your resolution on PC when it launched. That shows you all you really need to know. This game was rushed out the door probably to make a quick buck off people who remembered the series when it wasn't a punching bag. It's not all bad here. Graphically, the game looks pretty good, and these interpretations of the levels are fine. It's just the gameplay itself. I mean, look at how slow I'm moving here. Even the slowest Neversoft titles make this look awful. Even when you max out your stats, the physics are so floaty that it makes the game feel like moon gravity is on. So that's really all there is to it. A few unlockables here and there, a hand-picked selection of older levels, and the worst gameplay in a mainline entry up to this point. I feel like you're probably safe avoiding this one entirely. Stick with Pro Skater 2X or the newer remakes. Alright, so here's the obligatory Pro Skater 5 part of the video. This game sucks and everyone knows it. It's a lot worse than Pro Skater HD, even on simple things like graphics. And all that game's flaws are equally, if not more, applicable here. The levels are incredibly bland and uninspired. The opening one is literally just a room with some grind rails and quarter pipes in it. The goals are stupid and get tedious really fast. They're either completely recycled from previous games or even worse, they have some sort of stupid gimmick attached to them like getting pool balls out of a pool, or tricking so that your head doesn't explode. They really screwed up the special system here. Instead of having special moves, you activate your special bar to go into some weird state where all the moves are just special variations of normal moves that you could do anytime in the previous titles. The physics are somehow even worse and floatier than Pro Skater HD. Don't get me wrong, I don't like Pro Skater HD, and I understand that this game was definitely rushed. But there were 3 years in between the release of HD and this game, and not a single improvement. Yeah, you can do things like spine transfer and wall plant now, when it feels like working, but just about every conceivable factor of this game is a downgrade from any of the previous entries I've discussed in this video. I get that it's a spit in the face of the series, but honestly, my biggest problem with this game is that it's just so incredibly boring. Like, this is easily the least amount of fun I've had recording and writing for this video so far. And I honestly don't feel like the game is really even justifiable at all. It doesn't warrant a real review because they put no effort into it whatsoever. So I'm gonna match that by telling you, the game is garbage and not worth playing. Now, a few years ago, before we got the next game in this list, I'd say that for modern Tony Hawk fans, your best bet is to find the old PC ports of the 6th gen titles, or emulate the best entries in the series. But I'm glad to say that in 2020, there was a new Tony Hawk game done by a different studio than Robomoto. And thankfully, it's a significant improvement from any of the Robomoto titles, and lives up to Neversoft's vision of the series. Once again, taking the route of remaking the first 2 titles, this is probably the best game of the 3 that we've looked at that go for that same objective. Something really great about this game is that the people behind it were smart enough to realize that just because you're trying to create a nostalgic experience doesn't mean you have to strip the game down to just its absolute basics. This game is mechanically in-depth and about on par with Pro Skater 4 in terms of moves and tricks, even including some of the maneuvers that game lacks, like wall plants. When I first played this game on PS5 over at a friend's house, it was really easy to get used to, and felt great to just jump right in after being a fan of the series for so long. It really feels like a successor to the original 3 games without feeling like it jeopardizes the gameplay at all by removing features we've all gotten used to over the years. They did a great job at balancing the gameplay to feel really fluid and like the older titles, while also keeping things modern and not going back too far. It includes every level from Pro Skater 1 and 2, and even though they've appeared in so many Tony Hawk games up to this point, and it would have been nice to see some new levels, I get that it's a remake, and the levels are designed so well that it honestly is never a bad thing to come back to them. This is also bar none the best these levels have ever looked. This is definitely the best looking Tony Hawk game in the series, and it is such a joy to play. Vicarious Visions really knocked it out of the park with this one. So it's unfortunate to hear about their merger with Blizzard, which ruined any plans of a sequel, even though Tony Hawk himself confirmed that they were working on a remake of 3 and 4 as well. Even with that unfortunate news, I'm really glad that this game happened. It was able to prove that Tony Hawk as a franchise wasn't dead, and even though the future might look bleak on new titles, I've got a lot of games to keep playing until we get something new. Before I wrap this up and get into my personal ranking, I want to also give a shout to a couple of mods made by the community that are really impressive. First of all, I want to briefly mention Tony Hawk's Pro Skater Pro, which is a mod for the newest Pro Skater 1 and 2 remake on PC. The goal of THPS Pro is to add all the levels from previous Tony Hawk games into the new engine of the remake. So far, they've only gotten around to Pro Skater 3 and 4 levels, with a few underground levels thrown in there as well. But this is a really impressive and fun mod to mess around with. Playing Pro Skater 3 and 4 levels on this engine makes me even more sad about the cancelled remake of those games that never got made. But I'm glad we get to have a sort of glimpse into what that might have looked like. I recommend keeping up with their progress online because the strides that have been made here are really impressive and it updates frequently. It's really impressive, especially for a mod done by one person. I've got one more mod I'd like to mention here, and I saved it for last because it is, in my opinion, the definitive Tony Hawk experience. Thug Pro is a mod of Underground 2 for PC that compiles most levels from the series with a few exceptions, with a multitude of really in-depth options, all in one of the most cohesive engines in the entire series. Online is really easy to set up and works flawlessly. There are multiple characters to play as from different games. There's even options to change things like your UI. Are you like me and think American Wasteland's UI looks sick? You can use it in Thug Pro. Anytime I think about just wanting to quickly jump into some Tony Hawk and do some combos, this is the game that I instantly boot up, and it's an amazing mod and love letter to the series. It's also still getting regular updates, and is well worth a download. Well, I think that's about all the games I wanted to cover in this video, and wow. My original intention was to make a 10-minute long video essay about which Tony Hawk game was the best. But it's hard to get me to shut up about these games whenever I get started. This is one of my favorite game series of all time, and throughout its ups and downs, I gotta say, I get that the Robo-Moto games are really bad, and that the series definitely lost its luster after a while, but most of the mainline games I looked at in this video weren't that bad at all. Even some of the more polarizing ones like Project 8 and Proving Ground had their merits. And it's only really the Robo-Moto titles that are worth skipping entirely. I get that the series was milked dry with yearly entries, but am I the only one that didn't start getting bored with the series until it started retreading all its old ideas and executing them poorly? With that being said, it's shocking just how many of these titles are still excellent to come back to. And each of them occupy a different space for whatever you're in the mood for. Want to shut off your brain and have some stupid fun? Underground 2 and American Wasteland are the games for you. Want a classic Tony Hawk experience with smoothed edges and great gameplay? Pro Skater 3 or the new remake are your games. Want a story-focused experience with a convincing plot and great characters? The original Underground is your game. There's a game in this franchise for everyone, and it's pretty easy to see why these games have transcended their status as mere sports titles into a staple of video games in general. I mean, just look, Tony Hawk's right there at the top of Metacritic with Zelda. There's no forgetting the hard fall that the series suffered through the fault of its publisher, Activision. But there's also no erasing the sheer magnitude and history of its golden age, and the extensive lists of great games that are always worth coming back to. With that being said, here's my ranking of each entry in tier list form. You may have noticed that I've neglected to talk about something really important in this video, and that would be the soundtracks. But unfortunately, because of YouTube's copyright system, it makes it a little bit harder to go in depth and cover them with the respect they deserve. So I put together a video for the Patreon of me ranking the soundtracks. If you're interested in that, links in the description. Please subscribe, and thanks for watching.